MG Rob back with you. And today we're going to be tearing down a couple of B-Series engines for future builds. So we're going to tear some motors down here. This is the engine out of Captain Oblivious's 74 GT. We pulled it out a number of years ago and stuck it under the workbench and put a used engine in it to get him up and running after he had put one of the inverted oil filters on the oil filter here and it blew the seal out and he lost all his oil. And wasn't paying close enough attention to his gauges to realize it until he'd already done damage. Now obviously we got bad lifters, the cam was junk in it, because I had tried to look at this cam to put in my engine and found that it was bad. We're also going to tear this one down here, and this is actually a 74 engine from a non-overdrive car. I don't even remember where this came from, but I had stole the cam out of this to put into my autocrosser. So now I'm going to make this block the basis for my new engine for the autocrosser. And then while we're at it, I'm sending a bunch of cylinder heads up to the machine shop to have them all check for cracks. So I have a few other cylinder heads sitting over here yet, and some upstairs I'm going to have to look through to see what I'm going to take with me. And go through everything, see what's good, what's bad. That way I can get rid of the bad stuff so that when I have to move shop, I'm only taking the good stuff with me. So now this engine here is more likely going to get my old pistons and rods from my old engine, which were 30 over, with a late set of rods that were all balanced with ARP rod bolts in it. Where my engine is probably going to go ahead and get the same ones that I took out of my other engine, which are 60 over pistons with a set of max speeding rods on them. Alright, so Captain Oblivious got his motor all kind of stripped of all the stuff on the outside. We got it up on the engine stand. And we got the cam out. And cam actually didn't look terrible, but it is not reusable. But she doesn't want to put a stock cam back in anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Now, this thing had lost all of its oil, and he drove it off no oil pressure for a little while before he realized he had no oil pressure. And once we put oil back in it, the oil pressure was significantly lower, but it didn't seem to make any real noises and was running okay. But I happen to have a decent used engine sitting here at the time. We threw that in there and put this aside for a future rebuild. Figured we'd rebuild it in a year or two, and it's been about 8 years now. So we're finally getting to it. Now, as I'm looking it over, it was sludged up a little bit, but not terrible. This motor had at least 110,000 miles on it, and it doesn't appear to have ever been apart. And when we shake all the rod caps, you don't really see a whole bunch. A little bit of play in side-to-side thrust in this one, but not a bunch of... But this one does move a little bit. Now, since we're going to go ahead and put a whole different set of rods and everything in this, I'm not going to worry about marking all of these rods 1, 2, 3, 4 because they're not going back in. But I will mark the main caps. Now, number 1, we always know which one number 1 is because it's specific to number 1. It doesn't fit anywhere else. Same with 3 and 5. But 2 and 4 are the ones that you could get mixed up. So we're going to mark those. And from the front of the motor. So now, we'll go ahead and take all the rods loose, pull those out, and then we'll take a look at the bearings as we take them out. Alright, so now we got them all apart. Every piston just dropped out really easily, and had the top compression ring was broken on every single one of them. And then there's number 4. There's number 3. Actually, the one that felt the worst is the one that the cap side looks the best. Number 2 and number 1. So yeah, it did some damage. Actually, he was really close here. See some light scoring, nothing terrible, but we got to see some bluing just getting started in here, so he was getting dangerously close to potentially spinning a rod bearing on this journal, because this journal's been hot. You can see the corners here are much darker here than on the other ones. So yeah, good thing we pulled it when we did, or he'd have had a much bigger problem. Now we got to take the crankshaft out and see what those bearings look like. Alright, so now I got the crankshaft out. And there's the main bearings. And all the main caps. So definitely more of the copper showing on the rods than on the mains. But you can definitely smell it in the oil. And then that they were definitely had been hot and the oil was burnt. And yeah, it's a definitive smell. But the crankshaft looks pretty decent. It'll clean up just fine. Probably it'll probably end up 10-10 maybe. But you can see here some heat build up, so we'll have to actually think about this one for a minute now that I'm seeing that much color. And surprisingly, with as many miles as this thing had on it, because like I said, this car had somewhere around 110, 115,000 miles, somewhere like that, when we pulled this motor. And as far as we know, it's the original engine, and it shows no signs of having ever been rebuilt. The thrust washers look surprisingly good, and the bores actually don't have nearly as much of a ridge on them as I would expect for that kind of mileage. I've seen lower mileage motors with worse ridges than that. So that's what you get with a nice adult-driven engine, right? Even if the adult was a Hoonigan. Because he did tell me that in between where we saw all the oil on the ground where it blew out and where he ended up stopping at, he did at least one burnout, or at least as much of a burnout as the car is capable of doing. So yeah, it's nice and easy on the car. So that's his engine tore apart. Now we just got to get the block all cleaned up and knock out all the oil galley plugs that I'm going to knock out to make sure that it gets properly cleaned in the tank. And then we'll throw that one up on the stand and get it apart. Alright, so this one here, which is going to be my engine, is something I know nothing about this engine. I don't even remember where it came from. But it did come to me with no pistons or rods in it, but the oil pan on it, and no cylinder head. But the crank seems to turn just fine in it. And I thought maybe it might make a good base for me to build my motor off of, since mine had already broken the rear main, the fourth main cap twice. And the crank's already been turned a couple times. I thought I would start with a fresh block and a fresh crank to build a new motor. Alright, so a part of preparing the blocks to go to the machine shop is I take out the oil galley plugs. There's some here at this end and at the front end of the block. That way, when it goes in the hot tank, all the oil galleys can actually get properly cleaned out. That's a step that a lot of people forget about. So the way I like to take them out, like a 3/16 drill bit here. Just drill a hole, and I got a 1/4 tap. And a bolt or a nut that's large enough to be bigger than the outside diameter of the plug. A bolt with a couple washers. And then just crank it right on out of there. Now just a little example of some of the schmutz that can be hanging out in that part of the oil galley that can have a hard time of getting cleaned out. And I've seen it a whole lot worse than that before. That one's not that bad. I had actually recorded one more little tech tip about preparing the blocks to go to the machine shop, but my wireless mic had somehow disconnected and I didn't have any audio at all for it. So we didn't include that in this video. Maybe in a future video when I do another engine. At any rate, if you like what I'm doing, like, subscribe, share with your friends. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you're notified when new videos come up. This is MG Rob. Later.